The center of Paris is imploding, and the capital doesn't have much green space left for its 2 million inhabitants. By comparison, Berlin has around 25 square meters of green space per inhabitant. In London, it's 45 square meters, but central Paris has only 5 square meters. Do these extreme urban conditions mean the end of biodiversity, be it plant or animal? And just what has managed to survive of this ravaged nature? Nathalie Machon is an ecologist specialized in the plant life of Paris, which she tracks down in the most built-up, improbable corners of the city.
Of the world's big cities, Paris is not necessarily the one with the most biodiversity, because it wasn't planned around large city parks or around forests, even though we do have the Bois de Vincennes and the Bois de Boulogne, which play an important environmental role. But all in all, there are a good number of species that manage to live in Paris. There are an estimated 1,000 species of wild plants, plants not cultivated by the Parisians. And there are a lot of birds, quite a lot of insects, snails, little creatures that we can't necessarily see, but they're there, living with us.
And so for naturalists in search of biodiversity, the Parisian parks and squares are a happy hunting ground.
That's the song of the short-toed tree creeper. It's calling back. That crow just took a bath, and now he's smoothing his feathers. He's perched up there to catch the sunlight, and he's grooming his plumage, as birds always do after a bath. We have about 60 resident species that nest in Paris, but to that figure, you have to add all the transient birds, birds that come through on their migrations, but come and stay for winter. They don't nest here in Paris, but they do make up part of the biodiversity.
Paris wildlife boasts more than 1,000 wild plants, buttercups, speedwell, ferns, orchids, and thousands of animal species, mostly insects. But the inventories are still in progress, and for scientists, these figures still aren't satisfactory. The ecologists at the Museum of Natural History are forever warning the capital about the fragility of its biodiversity.
We've taken stock of the plants. We have a good idea of the number of birds. We know pretty much what butterflies and beetles we have, okay. But the figures are derisory compared to an overall biodiversity of thousands and thousands of species. We can't boast about a thriving biodiversity just because we've cataloged 2,000 or 3,000 of these species. We're far behind other cities like Berlin or Vienna. And that brings us to why this is. Paris is a city center. It's not a city with residential neighborhoods and large urban landscaped parks. We don't have that in Paris.
Overpopulated, dense, cramped, Paris is suffocating, and its biodiversity is being stifled. The capital would like to be greener, but doesn't know how to go about it. To bring about such a transformation, it would have to push back its walls. And the problem it always runs up against is that age-old handicap, a chronic lack of space. In the 4th century, back in Roman times when Paris was called Lutetia, it was already a compact city crouched on the banks of the river Seine.
The Roman city was on the south bank of the Seine. It went more or less from where the Pantheon is today to where you now have the Jardin des Plantes. That was the Roman city. Subsequently, it developed outwards in concentric circles.
Down through the centuries, Paris would keep this configuration, continually rebuilding on top of itself. And in addition to this concentric spread, there was another hindrance: the successive sets of outer walls. The ramparts the city had time after time erected for defense ended up by confining it. And in a way, the périphérique, the ring road circling Paris, is the last of those ramparts. Completed in 1973, this 35-kilometer ribbon of asphalt surrounds the capital and isolates it from its suburbs. The population continues to grow, but its area hardly at all. Paris is now one of the world's most densely populated cities. Over 21,000 inhabitants per square kilometer, twice the density of New York.
You could describe Paris as a city that is large, compact, dense, and old, with some widely scattered breathing spaces.
For a long time, Paris considered nature inappropriate and forced it out beyond the city walls. The only green oases were quite artificial, completely man-made and reserved for the elite. This was the case of the Tuileries Gardens, entirely redesigned in the 17th century by André Le Nôtre at the request of Louis XIV.
At first, the Tuileries Gardens carried on the concept of the closed space, of the symbolic cloistered gardens of the Middle Ages. Later, they opened out onto the landscape. But initially, the garden was a closed, intimate space, an ideal world where nature had been tamed and groomed, lawns trimmed down to the millimeter, all strictly laid out, greenery, boxwood trees, oaks, etc., all pruned, trees planted in straight lines, which is not really how nature is.
This nature, all parceled up and contained, was long off limits to the general public. It was not opened up to Parisians until the French Revolution. Eventually, in the second half of the 19th century, Baron Haussmann's urban renewal project under Napoleon III opened up more green spaces to the population.
Haussmann's idea was to create promenades in Paris. In other words, a large network made up of the two major parks and other parks, gardens, tree-lined boulevards and avenues. The idea was for Paris to have a garden in each neighborhood. And so, for the first time, they created a network designed so that everyone would have a garden nearby.
Today, Paris has over 400 squares, parks, and gardens, along with its two vast parks, the Bois de Vincennes in the east and the Bois de Boulogne in the west. But for the scientists, this is insufficient and too fragmented to have any significant effect on biodiversity. And yet, Haussmann's urban renewal project, with its goal of creating a green network, was truly visionary. For today, reconnecting the islands of nature to create a green urban network is at the heart of Paris's environmental ambitions. To achieve this, the city is now searching out the least bit of space to re-green. And suddenly, places that were previously never imagined as natural now seem obvious choices. Like the banks of the Seine, that long 13-kilometer serpent gripped in the talons of the automobile traffic. Until now, Paris saw its river as a strictly functional navigation corridor. But today, a radically new process seems to be at work. In 2013, Paris, in creating the first public garden on the water, made the leap from virtual to real.
This installation has to work on 3 different levels. First, we're on barges, so we have floating objects to deal with. On top of that, there's the whole garden aspect. And lastly, it's open to the public, with all the safety regulations that implies. It's the fruit of 2.5 years' work.
That's right. It's an amazing technical feat with a system of islands moored to sturdy piles sunk into the riverbed down to a depth of 8 meters, which allows the islands on their huge piles to rise and fall with the water level, and even withstand floods that can happen once a century, like the one back in 1910.
These 5 little islands, which cover 1,800 square meters, are a haven of greenery, with 3,000 grasses, 60 trees, 280 bushes. A parcel of natural landscape resting on a steel structure.
So here we're in a rather special place, in the hold of the barge. These are huge 170-ton metal caissons that buoy up the soil. Down here we have a whole system to regulate the flotation, which means keeping the barge level at all times. Not perfectly level, but as level as possible. And also a pumping system in case of accident. And lastly, another waterworks system dedicated to watering the whole garden. So here, Paris is launching a program to reclaim the river, as well as an innovative process of renewing the public urban space. The point of this project is to see how we can take a different approach to the public space. I think the city of tomorrow, and even of today, is a city that is constantly updating, meaning that we'll have our finger on the pulse of what people want, then work with them to make it happen.
But these projects are quite costly. This one cost more than 8 million euros. It's easy to see why this is Paris's only floating garden. Yet the Seine does have an important role to play in the urban space of tomorrow, and this floating garden is merely a part of the development project along the river. The mayor of Paris is declaring war on the almighty automobile and has made reclaiming the riverbanks the linchpin of his ecology program. According to figures published by City Hall, this pedestrian program has, over 10 years, led to a 25% decrease in motor vehicle traffic, which in turn has greatly improved air quality. And Parisians are forging ahead to bring nature back to the spaces that have so long been denied to them.